Hello. Welcome to this session on the media and national security. I'm George Beebe. I'm Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. Effective national security policy requires a lot of things. It requires a sound understanding of relevant facts. It requires strict adherence to the rules and regulations that circumscribe government actions. It requires a pragmatic balance between what might work on paper and what is politically palatable in practice. And if you're going to have national security, you need a nation, first and foremost, that is hanging together in some way that you can secure. And I think what we're seeing in recent years is that the media play a vital role in all of these aspects of our national security. And I think a lot of us have some significant doubts that they're playing their roles very effectively. And this is exactly what we want to talk about in today's discussion. And we have an illustrious panel of experts here to offer their views on things. Martin Gurri is a visiting research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He's also a former senior media analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. He's the author of the book, The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium, which was first published several years ago and then updated, but I think was quite prescient in anticipating the kinds of problems that we're addressing in today's discussion. Mollie Hemingway is a senior editor at the Federalist. She's a contributor for Fox News and a senior journalism fellow at Hillsdale College. She has a book coming out in a few weeks that's titled Rigged: How the Media, Big Tech, and Democrats Seized Our Elections, which I think sounds very on the topic of what we're discussing today. And finally, Michael Kimmage is a professor at Catholic University. He's a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And he was on the State Department's policy planning staff during the Obama administration and had to contend with making policy in the media environment that we're facing in the United States and in the world. So I'd like to jump right into posing some questions to our panelists. And I will remind our live audience that at the bottom of your screen, you have a Q&A icon that you can use to submit questions. And I encourage you to do that as our discussion proceeds. I want to begin with Martin Gurri. Martin, you published an article in City Journal a few months ago titled Slouching Toward Post-Journalism, in which you describe some fundamental changes in the media's approach to the craft of journalism and to the business model that they're employing. What do you mean by post-journalism? What has changed in the media environment, and why do you think these changes have happened?
Well, first of all, I didn't coin the term. It was coined by a brilliant media analyst called Andre Mir, who has a book of that title. Secondly, the changes are fundamental. I am not a young man, as you can probably tell. I grew up in a world in which newspapers, the news, did not sell to customers. They sold eyeballs to advertisers. So a certain kind of process was developed to attract eyeballs without dividing that public, so there could be a consumerist herd, a mass that could be sold things without a whole lot of controversy. It entailed that voice of God idea of old journalism. It entailed very sharp separation between what was supposed to be reporting and what was supposed to be opinion. And it enjoyed a great deal of success, essentially because at the local level, at least, there was a monopoly given to these news providers, these newspapers. That blew up with the digital era. It completely blew up. Every advertiser has fled online. There isn't a penny to be had that for the newspapers, practically. So certain newspapers, most of them are going to go belly up. I mean, that's just the fate. But certain newspapers with big brand names, like the New York Times, have transitioned to what Mir calls post-journalism. They are not, you're still not selling news to consumers. You're selling sort of a creed, almost religious belief in a political cause, which you articulate much better than they can. You give them information that they can then go out and repeat and recirculate through this immense digital sphere. And of course, the key element of that was Donald Trump. When Donald Trump arrived on the scene, there were 1 million digital subscribers, less than 1 million digital subscribers to the Times, and it was flat. Growth was flat. By the time he left, there was 7 million, and it was skyrocketing. So he was the essential element. They succeeded almost too well, I suspect. Now that Trump isn't there, it's going to be interesting to see. And I know Andre, I talked to him and he said, let's watch those every quarter. Let's watch those digital subscription numbers. I noticed they were very flat in the second quarter. But essentially, post-journalism does not even attempt to replicate the model of the 20th century, which pretended to be objective, pretended to be sort of coming down from above, almost omniscient, with no individual voice, no individual opinion. This is just the facts. It is quite the opposite of that. It gives you a very sharp, opinionated, in Andre's word, it commodifies polarization.
Just to follow up on this, Martin, what was wrong with the old journalist model? Why wouldn't that work under new media conditions? Why did it have to be abandoned for something new?
Because it was based on a monopoly, and that monopoly is gone.
Mm-hmm.
That simple.
Mollie, you're working in this world. You're a practicing journalist, a print journalist, a media commentator. What does this situation look like from your perspective on the inside? Does Martin's picture ring true?
Absolutely. And when he's talking about the Times, I'm also thinking about The Atlantic, which was a great general interest magazine that had a readership that was not totally ideologically pigeonholed. It had a perspective, but not such a strong one. They prided themselves on having a wide variety of arguments in their pages. And I saw something President Trump had put out a few weeks ago where he said that he was highlighting a story showing that The Atlantic was dealing with very precipitous financial issues of losing $20 million a year. And so he was calling it a failure. Well, it's only a failure if you don't understand what good can be accomplished by its donors, or what the donors view as the good that is accomplished. So the Atlantic Monthly does lose a lot of money, but they have so much power or control over a conversation. Was $20 million a good price to pay for seriously affecting the last election? It's actually pretty good bang for your buck. And you think about some of the stories that came out in the Atlantic. Editor Jeffrey Goldberg, of course, known for his role in receiving and regurgitating leaks about the Iraq War. But in the last election, also, he's the one who put out the completely debunked story that very seriously affected the election, that was based on literally nothing verifiable at all. But he claimed that he had anonymous sources who said that President Trump had horribly disparaged soldiers. There was no evidence for it. There was tons of evidence against it. You had arch enemies of Trump coming out and saying, they were in the room where it happened and it didn't actually occur. And yet it was used in ads. It was asked about in a debate as if it were true. And there was also the role that the Atlantic played in another story that kind of relates to what we're talking about of the Russian bounty story. And so they were big pushers of this idea that Russia was offering bounties for American troops. It later turned out that that was completely not true. It was once again based on anonymous sources. It was debunked, and yet it had such a large role in the election. So I think what you're seeing is this different model from people trying to reach out to a wide variety of subscribers or readers so they can sell ads, to now just realizing they're basically a major political player. And so they're going to get a nice political funding for particular outcomes. the one thing I wanted to also add to what Martin was saying is that while this is a deviation from what we experienced in the middle of the last century, it is kind of a return to what we saw earlier on in the Republic, when people did understand that media outlets were political and were trying to achieve partisan aims, and that they weren't particularly trustworthy as a result.
Michael, I want you to put on your historian's hat now, because Mollie has compared the situation that we're facing today to earlier periods in the history of our country, periods of what they called yellow journalism, periods of pamphleting back in the post-colonial period. What is your thought on this? Is the current post-journalist environment, as Martin has described it, something that is compatible with the system of governance that our founding fathers set up way back when? Can the institutions of governance, and I'm defining that very broadly to include not just statutory government organizations, but institutions like the media, like community institutions, non-government institutions that are important to our self-governance in this country, can they function effectively in this new environment?
I think the answer is yes, and it's very, I think, good to bring a historical dimension into this. If we would focus on the figure of Thomas Jefferson, and all roads in American history sort of go back to Thomas Jefferson or come to us from him, you can think of sort of two aspects of the problem. On the one hand, he was the victim of enormously vicious attacks. Certainly no less vicious than what we see in the public sphere at the present moment, sometimes presented as poems, sometimes presented just as kind of doggerel, and then sometimes presented as serious journalism. And everything Mollie was saying a moment ago about campaigning and trying to use the information space to affect the outcome of elections, all of that applied back in Jefferson's time, at least in terms of the spirit of this kind of thing. I think with the absence of social media, the dynamics are clearly different, but the intent of people to sort of play a manipulative role, to play fast and loose, to use character assassination, that is as old as the Republic. And so, I think the Constitution is founded with an eye to that. Freedom of speech is absolute, as is freedom of the press in the American constitutional order. But I think to sort of finish the point with Jefferson, at the beginning of the story, his response would have been the crucial importance of an educated citizenry. So you have the Library of Congress and you have the University of Virginia as part of Jefferson's career, which for him was innately political. I mean, not in the sense of party politics, but you need a citizenry that can take this in, that can sort of think critically, that can sustain a debate. And I think we have that too at the present moment. I wouldn't be overly pessimistic, but that's absolutely crucial. I think there's no self-governance without that. The alternative is anarchy. So in terms of institutions, probably we need to update for a world of new media, but the answer there too is sort of as old as the Republic. It's these educational projects and educational ventures, public libraries, public education. You see a lot of that in the 19th century, and I think that was understood as a kind of anchor in Republican politics. Reasoned and considered debate. We're certainly not far ahead of where people were in the 19th century, but we face a similar problem, and I suspect we would benefit from a similar solution.
You've talked about the importance of an educated citizenry to effective self-governance. What about disinformation? This is a term that was familiar to people in Martin's and my former incarnations in the intelligence world. We ran across this, but it was a term of art that really you only heard from specialists in that intelligence community. It has become much more common to hear this term in the media, in the general popular discourse that we're engaging in, and a lot of accusations of disinformation being thrown back and forth between partisans in our public debates. And a lot of worrying about what to do about this problem, a lot of concern that people are misinforming and disinforming people in ways that preclude effective policymaking and educated citizenry. Martin, can you talk a little bit about this term disinformation? How serious a problem is it? Is this new and different than what we've had to deal with in the past? And what might we do about it?
Let me tell you a story. When I first joined CIA, they would brag about how in post-war Italy, they had seeded these articles that had been published in these newspapers. They had an election coming, the communists looked certain to win, right? And the CIA was trying to desperately somehow work it so that in a normal democratic environment, the Catholic Party would win instead. And sure enough, they got all these articles published by all these public intellectuals, and guess what? The communists lost. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And it literally took me 20 years to start thinking about it. And my first thought was, at that time, the vast majority of communist voters were in southern Italy. They were illiterates, right? Secondly, the communists had their own very highly intellectual, very high-powered press in Italy. They weren't reading these other guys that were being published. Disinformation is a thing in the sense that people publish lies or twist the truth to try and manipulate the public, but call me a complete contrarian in this. I don't believe that elections are won by articles, and I have yet to see how a chain of evidence, I'm not saying that it hasn't happened, but I've yet to see a chain of evidence in which some sort of distorted fake news campaign swings public opinion in any direction. It certainly didn't happen in 2016.
I love this term disinformation and how it is supposed to be about fake news that affects elections. The term sort of, I think, became more popular in public consciousness in 2016, as you note, when the argument was that it wasn't that the establishment had completely misread the electorate and the issues that motivated the electorate. No, the real problem was that Russians had put some Facebook memes out. And the real disinformation there was the arguments about disinformation. And so I do think disinformation plays a powerful role in our culture, but unfortunately for us right now, the biggest purveyors of disinformation are our corporate media themselves. And this is a great example, just looking at the Russia collusion hoax, which was largely a media operation working with political actors and corrupt intelligence officials to create a completely ludicrous theory that Donald Trump didn't really win the 2016 election. No, he stole it because he was a traitor who colluded with Russia, and they put out these memes that made Hillary Clinton look bad. I mean, it's an insane idea, and yet it's actually believed by a shockingly high percentage of the population. I love the idea that we should trust people to handle, Michael was saying about trusting ability of the public to kind of read through some of this stuff. But unfortunately, it's very difficult, particularly when you've got such powerful elite power structures that are all in agreement that they're going to go with this disinformation. And that's what the Russia collusion hoax was. It was disinformation. It was disinformation that actually turned out to be rooted in a paid political operation. And it has spread worldwide, and it has caused so many problems. It actually it's a threat to the Republic because it hampers foreign policy. It hampers the ability of people to have healthy interactions with nuclear powers. It hampers the ability to have a domestic policy agenda. It targets innocent Americans. And the idea that you would care that, I mean, not that I do care that adversaries put out fake memes on Facebook, but like it turned out that the major operation by the Russians was to sow distrust and chaos. It targeted both left and right. It was anti both political parties. The idea that that's more important than people losing any journalistic integrity and just regurgitating completely insane and outlandish allegations, that is such a bigger problem than whatever the Russians managed to do.
To jump in quickly and just add some brief points in terms of foreign powers sort of trying to manipulate the American political sphere. I think that that's that's old hat. We think go back to 1968, the Tet Offensive, and that was a military failure for North Vietnam, but it was information and political success, and really sort of threw a monkey wrench into domestic American politics. I would say that the sort of social media environment of the present offers more opportunities for manipulation whenever the outside power is. So the problem it's not a new problem, but it's sort of become larger. I would here emphasize that Martin used the phrase, it's a very effective one, I think, of commodified polarization. If there's an incentive to polarize on the part of the media, that makes them much more vulnerable to outside manipulation. So that you can see it on the left, you can see it on the right. When you have that incentive, it's all the more dangerous. So we need analytically, I think, to connect that sort of commodified polarization to the powers that other governments are seeking to manipulate our domestic politics. And finally, a sort of third point, which I think is a broader crisis, it's not just a media crisis. We don't seem to have institutions that can sort of rise above the fray at the moment. It's not the universities, it's not the government, it's not the two political parties by any means, and it's not the newspapers. It goes back also to what Martin was saying at the beginning of the conversation, that there's sort of a creedal impulse in the newspaper. So who's going to do it? Who's going to sort of take that step above and point to something that's disinformation and sort of take us out of this swamp of partisan invective and conspiracy theories and all of that? And there I do have very grave concerns. I wish I could think of an institution that we could invest in that would do that, but I just don't see it. And there, when I think about what the next couple of years holds, I feel myself, unfortunately, kind of pessimistic.
Martin, any thoughts on that? We're starting to get into the what do we do about this situation problem. And I think that, if anything, is even more difficult than trying to understand the problem. If we're in a situation where institutions are losing authority, losing control, contending with a media environment that repudiates them, that undermines the authority and respect for those institutions, how can you restore governance? Is it possible under this situation?
I'm going to dodge that question by saying the first thing you have to do is understand what is actually happening. And I'm not really sure that we're getting at that here. Number one, we talk about media. What are we talking about? Okay, the amount of information in the world today available to me in this little computer that I'm standing in front of is practically infinite. All right. What subset of that is what we call media? And what makes that in any sense distinguishable from the rest? I mean, not that long ago, I could go to Twitter and I could tweet something and there was a precedent right below me. And I could even call them names if I wanted to right there, okay? So it seems to me that what is important isn't some old 20th century idea when, of course, the media had an enormous percentage of total information pie and had a direct access to the public. So it was important for political elites to control the media in some sense and convey to them that what they thought is important is what the media should think is important. And by and large, they were successful at that. I think what's important is the structure of information. And the structure of information today is radically different from what it was when I was a young man. And I think before you start talking about solving the problem and bringing the media into it, you have to deal with the structural issue of this immense, what I call tsunami of information that has basically exposed the institutions for being what they are. Human artifacts, full of failures, full of bullshit, full of lies. This is no more so and no more worse intended than, probably better than in most periods of history. But in the 20th century, all that was behind, everything was staged, and we were the audience, and we were told, and it looked very impressive. Now it all looks very tawdry, and it looks very self-serving. And I think the elites, honestly, are playing into that because they are, to an uncommon extent, tawdry and self-serving. But before you address the institutional issue, you have to realize that there's a structural question of information that has to be dealt with.
I think there's another structural issue too, which is the role that tech companies themselves play in mediating the media environment. And this is what makes everything so different to me than, we were talking about how in the past, media organizations were more partisan. But in the past, we didn't have such centralized control or attempts at censorship by such powerful and unaccountable large tech companies that can pretty easily, they can decide what will or will not be communicated on their platforms and what the effect of that might be. You know, it's not entirely that the effect of that is to completely squash a story. It also contributes to the distrust in institutions. It doesn't completely squash the story because people kind of sense what's important by what these tech companies allow you to talk about or don't allow you to talk about. It's very Pravda reading like, where you think, okay, this must be true because nobody refuted it, even if they censored it. That people have to become really high level media interpreters, and big tech is a big reason why they're having to be that way.
Yeah. I mean, Trump is banned from Twitter, but the Taliban is not, right? Having said that, though, I will disagree with the substance of the argument, because I think that again is a kind of a 20th century argument that you have to deal with content. And I think censorship in that sense is a very 20th century idea that you censor little types of content. What really is important is the structure. The structure of information sets the stage and arranges the props for the political drama. And I think what's happening is the elites, the people who are in charge, want it to be Hamlet. They want this drama to be Hamlet. It's important. It's a tragedy. And what we have is a Marx Brothers comedy, right? So essentially censorship at the content level is you take Groucho Marx and you tell him you have to say to be or not to be, but Groucho can say that as much as you want, and it's not going to be Hamlet. So we have the structural issue of the way the stage is set. You can't control little pipes of information here. They show up everywhere else. This is a world of infinite information. It has some influence. I'm not denying it. And it is wrong for these companies to play the truth game. I know what truth is, and I'm going to censor you guys. But in terms of the impact, it's the structure that matters.
I'm Martin, as I'm listening to you, I'm reminded of something that the old New York Times columnist Russell Baker once said. He said that the surest indicator of insanity is writing letters to the editor. A 20th century observation, I think. But it strikes me that we may have a situation here where our media structure is based upon the equivalent of writing letters to the editor. And that may be problematic when it comes to this question of epistemology, of trying to ascertain where truth lies on any given issue. We used to have people that did that for us, that worked in the media, whose jobs it was to perform that role. Right now, that role, it seems to me, has fallen to each and every individual to approach this in this new structure of information that's out there. And it's not an easy thing for people to do. I want to shift a little bit to this question of establishing facts when it comes to foreign policy. Mollie, you raised earlier the problems with the Russiagate issue and how media reporting created an impression of truth that was in fact false. That's not the only time that this has happened, I don't think, but it has profound implications for people who are trying to deal with the world. If you don't have your facts straight on the issues that you're dealing with, the prescriptions that you come up with for dealing with those situations oftentimes fail. And I wonder, Michael, if you might comment on this as from the perspective, not as a historian, but as a former policy planning official who was charged with trying to come up with prescriptions, what the United States ought to do in the world. How does the media environment affect that challenge?
Well, let me take, George, the example of Ukraine rather than Russia in this case, and just say a few things. vis-a-vis Ukraine. I've noticed, and I was in government 2014 to 2016, but of course have been following the Ukraine story since then. Who hasn't, right, in the last couple of years? But I've noticed that there are sort of three emphases that the media cares about in general when it comes to Ukraine. And the factual stuff is not bad. I mean, the facts are usually presented pretty well, but it's maybe more the narratives that are of interest to me at the moment. So drama, as in protests, massive street protests, gets lots of attention. Violence always gets attention, especially if soldiers are involved and there's a military dimension. Of course, that's correct. It should get lots of media attention. But if Russians mass troops on the Ukrainian border, there'll be lots of stories. If they pull back, those stories will sort of evaporate. And then thirdly, scandal. I mean, this particularly after 2016, all kinds of scandals that were associated with Ukraine. Some of which were exaggerated, some of which had a factual basis. That sort of got attention. So if you happen to fall policy-wise in any of those three domains, you're going to get a lot of media attention. Otherwise, when it comes to a country like Ukraine, the media is basically indifferent. And so the general public doesn't get a very complete or full picture. They get a very partial picture, which is dangerous because, democratic country, it's the public that should, in the scheme of things, be sort of setting the tone for foreign policy. But there's sort of another aspect of this, is the final point that I'll make, is that when you don't have a full picture that comes through critical discussion in the media, in the public sphere, a country like Ukraine gets left to a handful of sort of experts in the Beltway who often have ties of sentiment or financial ties to the country. And that really distorts the policymaking structure. I wouldn't say this was sort of problem number one when I was in government, but it's certainly something that I could notice, that the public sphere for us, if we would look at who was making noise about Ukraine, is a very small group of highly sort of motivated, concerned experts in Washington, D.C. For foreign policy, the public sphere for policymakers should be the public, the general public. But that, I felt, never worked very well. And I think I'm just using Ukraine in this case as a kind of representative example. A much more interesting example at the moment would be Afghanistan. I mean, just the huge media neglect of that story for the last 5 or so years. And now it's all getting caught up in the guise of violence and drama. And I think the public is experiencing a kind of whiplash. We didn't have the public weighing in as much as it should. If we were Denmark, if we were a small country, these concerns might be a little bit more academic, but for the world's superpower, the public's relation to the foreign policy making process is a truly important thing. And I think in many respects, we're, failing at the job.
Well, we have a question in from Paul Hare, who is senior fellow here at the Center for the National Interest. And I think is very much on the point that Michael has just made. He says, many journalists know their beats very well, but many international issues are often presented simplistically with little subtlety. He said, who monitors and keeps the media honest and educated on these matters? And I'll add a little bit on this. There was a time several decades ago when many newspapers and even many broadcast media kept active foreign bureaus in a lot of the world's capitals. And they were peopled by journalists that spent many years in those countries and developed an understanding of the culture, the society, the politics, and a broad array of sources that allowed them to provide insight from abroad to the American people. It's my impression that the number of those bureaus has decreased significantly, and that many of those bureaus are populated by people that more or less helicopter in and out, depending on the headlines of the given day. And we've lost a lot of depth to our foreign coverage as a result. Comments on this problem? Martin?
Well, I mean, you can always go, what you can do now that you couldn't do 40 years ago when all those foreign bureaus were teeming and journalists were flying first class, is you can go to the BBC website, which covers the world like a blanket. Now, BBC has a lot of silly, politically correct stories these days, but it is still the greatest news provider in the world. And I have access. And if you are interested in a country and you happen to know the language, you can go right there and read the local press. And there is almost always somebody in those countries that writes in English about that country, because English is the language of the web. So, and you know what? I mean, the kind of news bureaus that existed way back when were like some sort of vision deficiency, right? I mean, places like Israel and Palestine looked enormous, but if you were in the Congo, you were blind to that. I mean, you could be 1 million people dying in the Congo, and did you ever hear about it? No. But if somebody gets hurt in Israel or Palestine, it's a crisis. So I would say it's a mini tragedy.
Molly.
There was something you said in that about who holds the media accountable for getting things wrong. And I keep thinking back to what happened after the war in the march to the war in Iraq, where the media did a lot of self-analysis about how they had contributed to going into Iraq to search for weapons of mass destruction. And of course, a lot of that was because they received intelligence from intelligence officials that was so determinative, that was so clear that Saddam Hussein had these mobile weapons labs, and they really made the case for that. And of course, it turned out that was an intelligence failure. Germany had their source Curveball, who was a complete fabulist, who just wanted his family's political aspirations to do better in Iraq. And that also, the reports that came out after that from the CIA were that there were broad intelligence failures with that. And the media hadn't been critical enough. They had just been so excited to get these hot tips that they just received them and regurgitated them. And there were all these claims like, we will not do that again. We will not help this march to war by not checking out our sources better. And I'm pretty sure that it's gotten so much worse since then. Not only did the entire media industry become leak receptacles without checking out anything in the Russia collusion hoax that we talked about, and they gave themselves awards and promotions, and it's like nothing ever happened there. But you even see it with the coverage right now with Afghanistan, where there is this, you'd said that there hadn't been much coverage in recent years, and that's true, but I do think the Washington Post did great work with the Afghanistan papers, and that there wasn't enough public interest in that. That's true, in large part because the public was so insistent on just getting out of this nation building exercise. You can kind of feel that energy in these media outlets. They're being critical, mildly critical of Biden for the first time, because they do have these biases toward continuing war operations, and their story selection, their lack of resources on the ground are all contributing to this environment right now.
Michael?
There's a paradox, I think, of our present moment. I memean, Martin mentioned how much access to information we have in the BBC, and the sort of infinite information, which is, of course, a true state of affairs. On the other hand, it often feels like we've become more parochial in the last couple of years. And you really sense in the media, I mean, I don't mean the point really so much ideologically or party politically, but there are the sort of bubbles of the like mind that I have national security in mind and foreign affairs reporting. So you mentioned the sort of helicoptering in to foreign capitals. I'll stick again with the Ukraine example. There's much, much more interest in Ukraine in young, bright, motivated reformers who are the people who we think are like us and with whom it's easy to form conversations, English speakers and similarly educated, and much less interest, say, in recalcitrant pro-Russian communities in Odessa or Eastern Ukraine, who are also part of the political story. And so you get a kind of journalism. It's not that the facts are wrong, but they're very partially presented. And so you get these foreign countries where we sort of gravitate towards those who are most like us, or maybe in quotation marks, most like us. We have a very hard time processing stories where the people are unlike us. And I can't quite understand why that's the case, because it's interesting and you would think it would make for good journalism, but it just seems to be happening less and less. And it feels like it's a more parochial world, although, so cosmopolitan in, sort of superficially, but more parochial substantively.
It's a paradoxical observation because, as Martin has pointed out, the amount of information that is available out there in the world has exploded exponentially. We have access to all kinds of things, and yet our understanding and our focus seems to have narrowed under that circumstances rather than broadened. Exactly the opposite of what one might expect. Michael.
Just a quick footnote, I had meant to mention Samuel Huntington, his motif of Davos Man, which is of course a caricature of the sort of networked foreign policy elites of the 1990s, but there's a certain truth to it, right? The sort of Munich Security Conference sort of speaks for the world in a very deep way, and all of these storylines and narratives that are sort of outside of that domain get much too little attention, and that it really does have, I think, implications for our national security because we're building assumptions and expectations about the world on this very slender foundation of analysis and fact.
So Paul Hare's question raises the issue of oversight. How do we hold people accountable for performance? Now, he was asking how we hold the journalist community itself accountable for errors that are made. But I want to talk about the government. A lot of Americans, when they hear that term oversight, think about congressional committees with statutory responsibilities, investigative powers who are charged with overseeing the effectiveness and the legality of government actions. But the media have long played a critical role in informal oversight of what the government is doing. And there are classic examples. Watergate is the one that everyone looks to on this, but many others where the media have exposed wrongdoings and held government officials' feet to the fire on things in ways that have encouraged better behavior, better policy, more effectiveness. Is that role being performed effectively today under these new circumstances that we've been discussing? And what can be done to improve media oversight performance? I'm going to start with Mollie.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I have, it's something I've been thinking about a lot, and it's a challenging issue. I think about how it wasn't even that long ago that the media had just a fundamentally different idea about the role it would play. You're right that they viewed their job as being a check on the government. I don't think they're being a check on the government at all. They're more like partners with the government now. And you look at how when WikiLeaks happened or Edward Snowden's leaking, these things were covered by the media, I think, in fairly responsible ways. They understood what was happening as being a critique of the government. And now you just, even in recent months, the media are forming partnerships with DHS and other, FBI to like go after domestic political opponents, which is somewhat terrifying. Or I think about just the cooperative role they play. I was reading a profile of Maggie Haberman, the New York Times reporter, who won a Pulitzer for her role in the Russia collusion hoax. And it mentioned in this profile that she was the most cited journalist in the Mueller report. So you saw how these stories would then advance investigations, which would advance stories, which would advance investigations, even though it was all based on a tissue of lies. And that is not healthy because nobody, or very few people, were looking into, gosh, it seems like maybe the federal government abused the FISA process, or maybe they're abusing the role that intelligence officials used to play of planting information or leaking information. They themselves were getting placed on major media. I mean, the number of intelligence officials who had these very nice positions where they got to go on TV and do their work without the middleman, like you were talking, Martin, about planting stories to achieve a particular outcome, just cut out that middleman and just do it yourself, is alarming to me. And I don't see much incentive for how to pull back from that. I do think when you look at the credibility of the media right now, it almost can't go lower. I think it's very low. And even those numbers are sort of artificially propped up by a partisan sense that much of corporate media exists to support one political party over another. So you get higher numbers than you might otherwise get. And we have in this country had not just strong laws protecting press freedom, but also a culture of press freedom that is very good and important. As a result of that, there's been privilege associated with being a reporter. And that privilege was really in part a belief that reporters were trying to serve the common good and not just partisan interests. You know, you think of it just even in terms of they get to moderate presidential debates. Now, the more that they become accurately identified as propagandists in support of particular aims, the less they get to have roles like that. And I think that's important. Michael Malice always says that the country will be well served when people view media types as the equivalent of a tobacco executive. And that's true. Culturally, people need to stop pretending that corporate media are anything other than what they are. I think you also need to see a difference in funding. So right now, large corporate interests own and operate major media brands like Axios or something like that. The Atlantic is donor funded by far left donors. You need to see equivalent funding and support on the right, particularly because corporations are so invested. And so evening that out would create a healthier environment in a media sense. And then I think you've started to see federal judges say they're willing to revisit New York Times versus Sullivan, which is the ruling that gives the media a lot of power to do things without any accountability. You had Justice Thomas say he was ready to revisit it. There was the DC Circuit Court of Appeals dissent that said that there are problems that need to be revisited here. So I think you're going to see that bubble up more. And also you're starting to see newspapers and media outlets lose cases because they're violating some of these privileges that they have. They're exploiting them. And then I think finally you do need to tackle the big tech issue, somehow like regulating them like a utility. You know, a phone company doesn't get to determine who you talk to in the same way that the more monopolistic these tech companies are, the more they should maybe be treated like utilities. So those are some ideas, but I think people need to really start fleshing these out and come up with good policies, because it is a threat to the Republic, I think, to have this bad of a media environment with this much control.
Kelly Vlahos has a question that I think is very much related to this point. She asks, can your guest comment on the savviness of the US military during the early years of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in embedding journalists and controlling their movements and she says their message in order to shape the Pentagon's preferred message? How complicit was the media in protracting bad war policy?
I worked for a Gannett company, Army Times, that had quite a few embedded reporters at the onset of the Iraq War. I think it was hotly debated at the time how much to participate with the US government in this. I do wish people would remember that at the same time that media companies would embed to get that perspective, they would frequently also have tons of people who weren't embedded to get outside perspectives as well. And it is a challenge, as anyone can reasonably think through, to have, I mean, we see it with the need to evacuate all these reporters at different media outlets right now in Afghanistan. It is a security challenge. It does affect the US military. And I think, I don't have as big of a problem with it so long as it's not exclusively the way people are reporting on a war operation. Actually, just one real quick thing. I'm more concerned about the embedding that happens like domestically too, which can sometimes be quite literally embedding with people with particular interests. You know, you see so many people who are in the media, and I'm married to a reporter myself, but you see a lot of people who have close ties, family ties with politicians, political operatives, lobbyists, people with financial interests. We should be just as concerned about that as a reporter who's simply trying to get perspective in theater and goes, you know, and reports alongside troops for a few weeks.
Michael.
I think to start with Iraq, you know, over time, the media got the story right. I mean, it was very difficult at the beginning, especially with the emotions of September 11th and the beginning of a war to look very critically at what the government was doing. But over time, that I think did come into focus, WMDs and the I think in the end, the media acquitted itself as it should have, with some, sort of blips along the way. I wanted to make a point that goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. That's actually an optimistic point, and then one further point that's more pessimistic. But thinking back to sort of 2001, 2003, I think our landscape now, our intellectual landscape, is broader. There are more progressive voices that are sort of breaking through on foreign policy. Ezra Klein just had a very good piece on Afghanistan in yesterday's Times. And then, you sort of see many realist voices that are sometimes of the left and sometimes of the right. We're getting much bigger platforms than they used to. So one of the problems with September 11th is that you had only one segment of the debate that was really represented. And now that's different. I think you have more voices. Whether people are listening to those voices is another question. I'm not quite sure, but you have a more sort of diverse choir, intellectually diverse choir of voices. And that's very much to the good. If we had a more diverse intellectual choir in 2001, 2002, maybe we would have thought through certain questions differently, and the sort of neoconservative take on things would have been challenged sooner, which probably would have been quite beneficial. So I think in that sense, we're sort of making progress in some ways, and that's a choice of editors and others to seek out voices who are not only sort of within the DC mainstream. I do have a concern, though, with the soap operification of news, and even with the Afghanistan reporting, the photograph that's gotten so much attention of these 650 people being airlifted out is a very important photograph, but it speaks to our sentiments, and what we need is really sort of rigorous analysis. And I worry about just the absence of foreign news altogether. I mean, if you think back to the Trump years and think of the cable news, it was an endless conversation about our domestic political furies from one point of view or another. That's an important conversation. It should be taking place, but not to the exclusion of things like the war in Afghanistan or, sort of major parts of the world that demand our attention. So this sort of reduction of foreign news to the soap opera stories that we can all identify with and have sentiments about is dangerous. And then just the disappearance in some ways of foreign news as such is a really great concern.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Iraq to me seems like it could have been the Norman invasion of Britain, as far as I'm concerned. It seems like such an incredibly long time ago in terms of media structure and the questions we're facing today. So I don't have a whole lot of profound observation other than to say that I would not describe our current environment as diverse. I would describe it as fractured, which is an entirely different thing. And I think that describes our society as well. We are diverse and fractured, not necessarily along the same lines. So, and honestly, my belief has always been that journalists tend to be the mouthpieces, like the minor actors of the political drama. There's the people who are the big shakers and makers, and they have circles around them. And in times like right now, where things are so intense and I think in many ways irrational, journalists play an intense and irrational part given the people they're trying to support or the people they're trying to attack. And whereas in the old days, for strictly business reasons, there were things you were not allowed to say about other people. Now, I mean, calling in an actual report of a statement by Donald Trump saying that he lied or saying that he stated a falsehood, or putting more corrections of what the president had said than what actually Trump had said, became a norm. So I think what we're looking here is at a world which is the internetization of media, where everybody's yelling and screaming, and the issue is, how do you deal with that?
I wanted to push back on just a quick thing for Michael. I love the optimism from both of you, and it makes me feel like I should try to be more optimistic. But even this idea that we have this viewpoint diversity that we didn't have, that is true. And there's a little bit of optimism there. But you look at the structural biases, again, that keep them from being a real part of the conversation throughout the Trump era. in the larger media environment, basically, they're on the left, which everyone understands, and the right is given like a few positions in the media environment to sort of give an air that there is a diversity of viewpoints. And usually those people who get those positions serve as the systematic opposition. They're allowed into the tent so long as they don't actually disrupt the power structure in any way. And it was much worse during the Trump era in that this frenzy of obsession with opposition to him was so great that even those limited few positions for people on the right went to people who themselves were supportive of the larger aim of dethroning Donald Trump. And what was interesting about it was how much of that had to do with foreign policy. Those voices were almost uniformly interventionists who had caused so much of the rise of Donald Trump on the right, probably. They had censored or kept people from being able to express opposition to the Iraq War. You know, David Frum, you might remember, wrote the National Review piece, Unpatriotic Conservatives, just lambasting anybody on the right who was critical. These people controlled a lot of media organizations, and then they got elevated and given this powerful voice. It kept a lot of the conversation from happening. And so they still have such tremendous power over that conversation, and they continue to do so even up into this moment right now.
Let me just jump in for a second. Maybe it's worth qualifying whether we're discussing sort of elite media or media as such, because it seems to me, Mollie, that there is a pretty broad media landscape in the scheme of things. When you have talk radio, you have, certainly Fox News and Tucker Carlson, who's been, an ardent voice for a different kind of foreign policy during the Trump years and after the Trump years, but very large following. So it's true that if we would sort of confine our conversation to the elite media, then I think some of these structures work differently. But for, the media at large, maybe it goes back to Martin's point that it's fractious, that there are all these different islands of opinion, but it doesn't seem particularly homogeneous to me. And it is just interesting to observe. It would be an interesting book to write, the sort of emergence of the restraint argument. And if you listen to Biden's language yesterday, there's a lot of restraint argument, a lot of restraint language in it. When did that come about? How did it sort of negotiate itself with the media? But that seems in the last 10 years to be one of the most interesting and important transitions, with stimuli both on the left and on the right. But that's sort of a general response I might have to your comments.
Well, on that note of mixed pessimism and optimism, I'm going to bring this discussion to a close. We've reached the end of our hour. I want to thank all of our panelists for a very insightful and informative discussion, and we'll look forward to our next event with the Center for the National Interest. Thank you.